Welcome, everyone. Good morning. Good afternoon. First, I want to begin by saying how grateful we are that you've joined us today. We have an exciting presentation in store, and we appreciate you being with us and taking the time out of your day to join us. My name is Brendan Middleton, and I'm a part of the marketing team here at Avenue Insights and Analytics, and I'll be your host and moderator today. In partnership with UCLA Anderson Forecast, we are honored to bring you the first in a series of national and regional specific economic forecast presentations. Each of these webinars and roundtable discussions will consist of dedicated content focused on relevant economic trends that are affecting the state and local government landscape. Before we introduce our guest speakers, I do have just a couple quick updates. Our presentation is going to last about 45 minutes. We're going to follow that up with an interactive question and answer session. So I did want to point out right in the beginning, you can submit some questions and comments throughout the discussion. If there's a key point, if there's a comment that you'd like to make, or there's something that you would love for our guest presenters today to address at the end, utilize that chat feature here in your Teams application to address any of those related questions or comments. This presentation will be recorded, and we will be sending you a copy along with other related content shortly after our session today. And lastly, very important, in partnership with UCLA Anderson Forecast and other industry economists, we have launched a new program called Economic Insights that is exclusively for Avenue clients. Please stay tuned at the end of the presentation and be sure to hear all of the exciting details before we wrap up today. Trust me, you won't want to miss it. So with that, next I'd like to officially welcome our guest speakers. First, our special guest today, it's an honor to introduce Director of UCLA Anderson Forecast, Dr. Jerry Nickelsburg. Dr. Nickelsburg helps lead a team of world-renowned economists that provide economic forecasts for regional economies within the United States and is recognized as one of the most accurate and unbiased analysis across the country. Dr. Nickelsburg, thank you so much for being here. Welcome.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.
And next up, Avenue's VP of Government Relations, Fran Mancia. In quick summary, Fran oversees Avenue's legislative and government relations work at the federal, state, and local levels. Currently, Fran is a trustee of the California City Management Foundation and a regent emeritus of the University of California, where he recently was appointed as senior advisor to the president of the University of California. Fran, welcome. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you for doing this.
Great. Thank you, Brendan.
And with that, Fran, I will actually turn it over to you to get us started.
Sounds great. Thank you, Brendan. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you today. I'm particularly excited about the partnership that we have with UCLA Anderson Forecast. As Brendan mentioned, they are, in my view, certainly they're the premier forecast in the country and certainly most likely in the world as well. The goal of our partnership has been going on for almost a year now is to really provide unique perspectives to the ever-changing landscape that we're in terms of revenue forecasting and understand the economics and the dynamics that we're faced with so we can forecast, manage expectations, and plan our businesses properly. Our idea is to provide perspectives both from a micro and a macro level. Avenue, we really take a bottom-up approach to revenue forecasting for our clients as we build a forecast. We're looking at business-specific information in many cases. We build a foundation around sales tax, property tax, hotel tax, utility taxes, and the others, and build it from the ground up. And certainly UCLA brings their expertise from a macro perspective and a research perspective. For today's presentation, Jerry will be our primary presenter, and my role is really to provide some occasional commentary, serve as Jerry's wingman with some comments on local impacts to the topics discussed by Jerry today. So with that, I'd love to turn it over to my friend and esteemed colleague, Dr. Jerry Nickelsburg. Jerry, take it away. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Fran. Has my slideshow come up?
You're up. You're ready to go. Perfect.
Great. So thank you to Paul and Fran and the entire Avenue team for this invitation to talk about what I like talking about, which is what does data say about all of this information that's coming at us, and how do we make sense of it, and how do we think about the future? So I've entitled my talk today, COVID-19 Pandemic, Ukraine War, and a Booming Economy, and then a big question mark. And so let's just dive right in. We have critical questions today, and one of the important aspects of economic forecasting today is that the 2020 recession was a recession like no other since the recessions of 1918, 1919, and the follow-on 1920, 1921, which were associated with both the end of the First World War, but more importantly, the influenza pandemic. So the questions that we want to deal with today, and this is kind of our roadmap for the talk, are first the booming economy, and looking at that from an aggregate point of view. And at a couple of points, Fran, I want to turn to you and say, well, at a more micro view or more local view, what are you seeing? What are your clients and partners seeing? And then everyone's talking about inflation and the inflation of the 1970s and stagflation, and is this deja vu all over again? And then we want to break down this GDP growth that we're seeing now, this booming economy, by both state and by sector, industrial sector. And finally, take a deeper dive into two sectors that are really important as we go forward in the next couple of years: hospitality and housing. So let's begin with GDP. So GDP is our standard measure of what's happening with the economy. And the graph that you see in front of you is real GDP, so adjusted for inflation. The blues are actuals, and the light red is the year ahead. So that's going to be 2022. And the darker red is further in the future. And of course, we know less about further in the future than we do about 2022. And what we have here is in the blues that in the second quarter of 2021, the US economy, as measured by GDP, recovered to the previous peak, which was the fourth quarter of 2019, and grew thereafter. And how much did it grow thereafter? Well, this is a trend line, is 2.4% annual growth trend line. That's what the economy was doing prior to that 2020 recession. And you notice that the kind of the light red is below that trend line, but it's getting closer and closer. And by the end of this year, we expect to be back to trend. You can't kind of see this all that well, but we're going to be slightly above trend as we go out the next 2 years. And that's going to be driven in large part by an increase in productivity as firms move to adopt automation and software in the face of very tight labor markets and rising wages. So they're looking for labor-saving investments. And so let's turn to consumers. And I think you all have heard a lot about this. And what I'd like to do is kind of dig into data and say, well, where are there inconsistencies in the data? What does the data mean? This is the Michigan Consumer Sentiment Survey. Consumers in the US are pessimistic. And you see the little circle there that's on the right-hand side. That's where we are today. And that is similar to where we were coming out of the Great Recession, when the economy was in the tanks. So we have a strong economy, but consumers are really pessimistic. But the interesting thing about us Americans is when we're really happy, we go to the mall and go shopping. When we're really sad, we go to the mall and go shopping. So we may be pessimistic, but we are spending. And for the economic forecast, we want to look at what consumers are doing, not what they are saying about the economy. And remember, the consumption is 70% of GDP. And so what are consumers doing? Well, they're at record levels. Retail sales are at record levels. This chart has the latest data that was just released in this last week. And as you can kind of eyeball this, you see, wow, it really jumped up. And in terms of trends, let's look at the trend for the last expansion. That's the trend of increase in consumer spending. We're way above that. But you might say, well, we didn't have a lot of housing development then, a lot of housing construction, and new homes require a lot more in the way of consumer purchases. And we're seeing a lot of construction today. But in the previous expansion that included the speculative building of homes, so that's this, we're still way above trend. Households have good balance sheets. People have jobs, wages are going up, savings rates are high, and they're out spending on goods and services. And that's really driving the economy. And our expectation is that we're going to have solid growth in consumption going forward. So you see here in red, that's the forecast. After a banner year, 7.9%, which was partially a recovery from the 2020 recession, we've got 3% growth for the next 2 years. And then as economic growth slows down, as we get back to trend or a little bit above trend, then we're down to about a 2% growth in consumption. And one of the reasons for that is that all of that demand in the economy is driving down the unemployment rate. And this quarter, we're expecting an average of 3.9% as the unemployment rate. So we don't have all the data, and that's why that's in the first red block that you see there. And then it comes down all the way out in the out year in 2024 to 3.4%. Very tight labor markets. And when you have tight labor markets, it's really hard to grow faster than the labor force is growing. It's hard to get above about 2.5% growth rate. So that leads us to what the Federal Reserve is doing. So the Federal Reserve has two mandates: full employment. We just saw that. Just going back, there's full employment right there below 4%. So full employment and control of prices, control of inflation. And so now the Fed's focus is on inflation. And as you just saw, they just raised interest rates. This graph shows you on the bottom line, if you look at that, the red is the federal funds rate. So that's the rate that the Fed directly controls. And they're on a path to do about 6 increases in the federal funds rate this year. We have it going up to a bit over 2.5%, about 2.75% by the end of our forecast. The Fed could well decide to go faster and move up into the 3% range on the Fed funds rate. The next line on this graph that I'd like you to look at is the yellow one, which is the 10-year Treasury yield. And you notice that the red and yellow are kind of coming together, that there is some compression in the yield curve. That's because in this uncertain world, we are expecting increased wealth coming into the US in a flight to safety and landing in places like the 10-year Treasury bill. If that doesn't happen to the extent that we forecast, then expect that 10-year Treasury to be higher. That's going to impact other interest rates. So that's a real risk of the forecast, and something that we definitely need to keep our eye on. And this Fed policy, including tapering, that is the Fed getting out of the business of buying longer duration, longer term securities, is going to increase interest rates all across the board. And so at this point, I think, Fran, I'd like to turn to you and ask you, because something that we don't track across the country in the major markets is what's happening in municipal finance, municipal bond markets, and what do you see happening there as we go forward?
Yeah, thank you, Jerry. I think from a local perspective, there's this high demand for, bond rates are doing well. There's a high demand for stability in those areas. The local economies are strong and not really overly impacted by interest rates in a general sense. As Jerry mentioned earlier, 70% of our local economies are based on consumption, so they're doing very, really strong. We're not really expecting increases in interest rates to have major impacts on local revenues. In fact, there's a lot of demand to get back out there, and we're all getting tired of having the boxes show up at our door. That will never go away, certainly, but we have that pent-up demand to travel or to go to movies or entertainment. So I think those things are strong. Local governments, bonds are looking solid because investing in local governments is an attractive thing. It's a good balance. So we're very optimistic at the local level that things will continue to in a good way. And changing rates will not have a major impact.
So, so here in Los Angeles, where I live, we're seeing local governments investing in infrastructure at the airport, at the major airport of LAX, and at our seaports, and in other things. Are you seeing that kind of infrastructure investment funded by bonds coming into the municipal markets as well?
Yes, we are. And I think that's going to continue strongly. The place where there's some concern around the international airports, as you know, is we're having a lag in international travel because of the pandemic and the restrictions. For example, my sister lives in New Zealand, has not been able to come. The flights have been cut off. She's actually coming to visit next month for the first time after 3 years. So we're starting to see that opening, and there's an optimism that international travel over some time will come back. So there is an appetite to enhance these areas, and we're seeing that in airports across the country, not just the big hubs like in LAX, but also more regional locations as well are investing in regional airports in infrastructure. Plus, with the federal funding that's available, it's an attractive thing to do. So I think it bodes well for our economy over time.
Yeah. So the good news there is that New Zealand is certainly not a shabby place to be stuck, right?
No, exactly.
Okay. So moving on, not only municipal governments, but businesses are flush with cash, and they are incentivized to expand their ability to provide goods and services, because this is a booming economy. So we expect business investment this year to grow by over 10%. And then, it cools off a little bit, 2.5% next year, and then 4.7%. But the low interest rates this year, also with the expectation that interest rates are going up, is going to drive business investment this year. So that's another demand factor that really is going to be boosting the economy and gives us those GDP numbers that we saw at the outset. And we have one other new factor, which is that we have this booming economy, we have tight labor markets, and defense spending is going up. So you have two graphs here to look at. And on the left-hand side, I'd like you to look at the green line. That is federal defense spending in the U.S. as a percentage of U.S. GDP. And the trend is downward. It bumps up with the Vietnam War, with the Cold War, with the war on terror, and is bumping up once again. On the right-hand side, the blue line, that's the top line, that is federal defense spending in real terms, inflation-adjusted terms, and that's from 2000 to present. So you see the kind of the buildup with the Middle Eastern wars, and then it drops, a little bit of a buildup during the Trump administration, and then with the end of those Middle Eastern wars, it kind of tapers off. Our expectation is that the U.S. defense budget is going up. We have it going up to higher than it has been for quite a number of years, but we may not have it high enough. So we're going to have that stimulus, that additional demand into the U.S. economy. And it's not just going to be from the U.S., it's also going to be from our NATO partners. Just yesterday, Germany announced that they are going to be purchasing F-35s from Lockheed Martin and expect a lot more of that. So that is an additional demand into the economy. It's differential across states. So states such as Georgia and Texas and Ohio and California and Washington will be disproportionately benefited by this. It means an expansion of our manufacturing capabilities and good jobs. So that's all positive. But with this booming economy, we have to ask about inflation, right? So we have all of these different demands. It's driving the economy, and what's happening with inflation. We've seen the Fed has started to move on this, but let's take a look at the numbers and see what we know, at least from the data we have so far. So this is where we are today. And so this is through last month's inflation numbers. And that was up at 7.5%. And the chart you see is the monthly percentage change in consumer prices, the CPI. And the first thing you notice about this chart is there's a lot of noise in this series. You can't take any one month very seriously. It just bounces around through time. But let's go and look about back in the 70s. So this is what Professor Larry Summers, was commenting about in his editorial just the other day. In the 70s, we had stagflation, we had inflation and low GDP growth. Certainly we don't have low GDP growth in our forecast, and all the indications are we aren't going to have that. But there was high inflation, and that inflation was persistent. There was a wage price spiral going on, wages going up, prices going up, and so on, fed by monetary policy. And it was the Volcker recession of 1982 that you kind of see over on the right-hand side within that circle that brought that inflation down. That's what people are worried about. But there are a couple of other places where we see really high spikes here. These two, and after those two, you get very low inflation. So what was happening there? That's the end of World War II and the end of the Korean War. The economy was structured to produce goods and services to support the war effort. And then the GIs came home, they were flush with money, they were spending, and the economy had not adjusted. That's a supply chain constraint. And that's what we have today, are supply chain constraints. We'll take a little deeper dive into that momentarily. And then we have also another, that arrow should be a little further to the right, another peak like today, which was pretty much temporary. And that was the collapse of the global supply system in the early part of the 2008-2009 recession. So we don't have many data points. You're looking at 4 different data points here. Not a lot to do inference on, but let's see what's behind that red arrow. Oh, then just a comment that the inflation numbers today, they're not unusual. They are worrisome, but not unusual. So looking at the contribution to core CPI, so this is not including food and not including energy, and all the actions over on the right-hand side of this graph. It's in new cars, shelter, and used cars. And used cars, now we're seeing used car prices going down. And new cars, that's a supply chain constraint. That was because chips were not available to build cars in spite of consumer demand for those cars. We're seeing those being resolved. And as more new cars come on the market, less demand for used cars, these prices are not going to be persistent. They're very much dependent upon supply chain issues. In the middle there, we have shelter, and we're going to look at shelter a little more carefully. And then the balance is 1.5% balance here is in energy. We see some in food, but food's not a big part of American household budgets, although increases in the price of food, particularly for low-income Americans, is problematic. So let's turn, I think, first to energy. And what you see on the left-hand side are 2 graphs. Let's look at the upper left one first. That's the West Texas Intermediate oil price. And you can, and it's going from back in 2009 all the way up to present. And you can see on the right-hand side, there, I circled that. On the right-hand side, you can see it spikes, and that's the spike that we've just seen. But that's, pretty much the same as what we saw between around 2011 to 2014. And if we just kind of focus here, so that is the most recent, and this stretches back to before the Ukraine war. And we get this spike above $120 a barrel. And then it's been coming down. Today it was up a bit, and now it started, I looked just before I started talking, and it is starting to come back down below 100 once again. So there was kind of this temporary spike of, oh no, what's going to happen with the absence of Russia from world oil markets? And it turns out that the markets are thinking not a lot. And one of the reasons why they're thinking not a lot is production does respond to prices. So let's just get rid of that and look at what history is going to tell us about oil prices. So we start out on the left-hand side. We have this increase in oil prices to $100 a barrel. And U.S. production is on the graph on the right-hand side. And we get an increase in U.S. production in response to that. And then as we move forward in the soft economy of 2015, 2016, we were growing, but not as fast. Oil prices came down, and so did production, although not by much. Again, oil prices start going up. And in this time frame, what we have is that oil producers are becoming more efficient in drawing petroleum out of the ground. And that means they're doing it at lower cost. And so now we get a big boost in production. And then finally, we've got the 2020 pandemic-induced recession. No one was driving. The demand for petroleum dropped so much that at one point, prices were negative. People were paying others to store their petroleum. And so we get a drop in production. And in the US, the producers, particularly in our most efficient fields like the Permian Basin and the Bakken shale, stopped building oil drilling rigs. And they're engaged in hydraulic fracking. Hydraulic fracking requires frequent manufacturing of oil drilling rigs. And if you don't have them, you can't expand production. And so we're getting, as you see in the right-hand graph, we're getting some increase. We're getting new investment in rigs, but it's going to take some time for that production to come back. We're about 1 million barrels a day short of where we were in that peak that you see. But all of that means that we'll have this moderation in oil prices. They're not going to be driving up inflation, and ultimately oil prices are going to come down as we've seen historically. And so oil affects gasoline, and gasoline prices affect gasoline taxes. And so I imagine that's been going up. What's been happening across the country from your perspective, Fran?
No, it's a great question, Jerry. And I think your graphics illustrates the rise and fall of gas taxes. Generally, in most states, it comes under a sales tax. It correlates up and down. Generally in states, you're getting a percentage of the price per gallon at the pump. So in Texas and California, we follow that. And there's a strong correlation to the inflation and the economy in general. It rises and falls, as you're seeing in the graph here. So it's a huge portion of the sales tax revenue, as an example, comes from energy. Other one, of course, is auto sales. So it's become very unpredictable as it goes up and down. And so it's been harder to forecast, and we're continually refining our assumptions and our revenue forecast around that. And for the audience, this is another reason we work closely with UCLA. It provides us additional expertise and perspectives to help you estimate where your revenues are going. But in most cases, it rises and falls with the price of oil. So the good news is when gas prices are high, revenues are coming in strongly for local governments. Of course, that's not so good as a consumer. So it's not a stable force, but it literally follows the line you have on the screen, Jerry, is how we're seeing it.
Yeah, and one thing that we are seeing is we're seeing, for example, used car prices falling pretty rapidly right now. And that's because used cars tend to have worse gas mileage than new cars, as well as more new cars being available. Also, our expectation is that this is going to drive a more rapid shift into electric vehicles, right? So that's going to affect your revenue forecast, right?
Right. And we're seeing we work closely with the auto manufacturers. 9% approximately is in the market share for electric vehicles. It's continuing to grow. It's more efficient. So we're also factoring that into longer range forecasting, that over time, we're going to see some leveling and less reliance on fossil fuel vehicles, but it's certainly not going to go away. We're also seeing in many states where there's incentives in terms of legislation proposed to exempt zero emission trucks, cars, or hybrids from taxation up to a certain dollar amount. So there's incentives to do that. So that's something that's going to definitely affect revenue coming from gas tax going forward.
Great. Okay. So now moving forward, let's talk about shelter. And so what you see here is changes in rents, and this is all across the country. The darker the color, well, the blues are negative, and the darker the color, the higher rents have gone. And a couple of points I want to make on this slide. The first is in consumer prices, 1/3 of that inflation, 1/3 of the consumer price index is shelter costs and it's rental costs. And it is really overweighted. So this is kind of important. So what the Bureau of Labor Statistics does is they survey what people are paying for rents, and they take those average rents, and then they extrapolate that to everyone. Well, 2/3 of Americans own their homes, and so they're not renters, and increases in rents don't affect them. But in the CPI, what is imputed to them is the rents they would pay for the shelter that they have if they were renting it, but they're not. So this boosts the consumer price index, but it's, we have to take that with a bit of a grain of salt. It's also very much local. And so we see that on this graph. You see the light areas along the Pacific coast in the north and northeast, and the dark in the southwest across Texas and in the south, and especially in Florida. So these apartment rents are going up where people are moving, and so there's increased demand there, and that's affecting the national consumer price index, but it's not affecting across the board Americans, as you might think when you hear that CPI number. Is this going to continue? We're going to look at home prices in just a little bit, but you can't imagine that rents are going to go up at the rates that they've been going up forever, because everyone has a budget limitation, and so there's a limit to what they can in fact spend on rents. But where you see rents going up, for example, on the West Coast, you see it in Spokane, Boise, Salt Lake City, Las Vegas, Phoenix, and Tucson. You have migration and you have a shortage of housing, and that's pushed up rents. So that's the shelter part. And all of this, tells us that the increases in inflation that we've seen, and we will probably see over the coming months, are really related to very specific factors, and not necessarily a wage price spiral. But the wage price spiral is a worry. So let's take a look at that. Here you see average hourly earnings. It's the year over year percentage change for a whole bunch of sectors. And you notice that most of them are clustered towards the bottom, and most of them are going up at a rate lower than the rate of inflation, although they support it somewhat. But notice on the right-hand side here, they've all sort of started to turn down. The one real exception is the red line there. That's leisure and hospitality. This is a shortage of workers, and as well, those jobs have become much riskier in the sense that there is a greater exposure to disease transmission than there was, or at least the perception that there was pre-pandemic. So higher wages are being demanded, and people are deciding that's not the kind of work they want to do. But nevertheless, those wages are starting to come down. So we're really not seeing evidence of a wage price spiral yet, but this is something we need to keep our eye on, because if this turns around and we have continual increases in wages at a rate that's about the rate of inflation, then we're looking at the 1970s again. But so far, we haven't seen anything that suggests we're in a 1970s environment. However, we have much higher risk today that we're going to enter that. So something to keep our eye on as we go forward. But our inflation forecast is for fairly high inflation this year. And some of these things are built in, and then coming down. And as we get into 2023 and 2024, we're going to move back to the kind of inflation rates that we saw prior to the pandemic. Lots of risk here. If Asian factories keep shutting down with a zero COVID policy, is happening today in China, if we get a new wave of the pandemic that impacts supply chains. We have uncertainty, geopolitical uncertainty, lots of things that can affect inflation. And so this is something that we really do need to look at, and look at this forecast as, well, this may be the most likely, but it embodies a lot of assumptions, and those assumptions may be wrong. And so we may get much higher inflation, and we definitely need to keep our eye on that. So let's turn back to GDP. We have a booming economy, and let's break that down geographically. So about half the states in the US have more than 5 million population, and those are the states that really make up most of GDP. So we have quite a number of small states like Wyoming and Alaska, which are in North Dakota, dependent on extractive industries, and their GDP growth rates will move with energy prices. But US GDP is really driven by these large states. So let's look at the large states, and we're going to look at the left-hand graph first. And on the right-hand side is the US, that's in the light blue. And then these are all of the states to the left of it in 2020 that contracted less than the US, so it's kind of holding the US up. And I've highlighted 3 because California, Florida, and Texas have this friendly rivalry. So California's in yellow, it's supposed to be gold. Florida, of course, is orange, and Texas is longhorn brown. But what you notice here is that all 3 of these states contracted less than the US, and California's actually contracted less than Florida and Texas. The state that contracted the least, all the way over on the left, is Washington State. And the why of that is going to be important. On the right-hand side are the first 3 quarters of 2021. We don't have the fourth quarter yet. We had 5.7% for the year, but these are just the 3 quarters because the state breakdown is yet to come out from the Bureau of Economic Analysis. And California's number 1 here. And these are all the states that are growing faster than the US. So more states than you saw on the left-hand side. And so we have an economy that is growing, but it's growing in sort of different proportions. And we want to ask why. And the reason, and in particular, when we look at this, we say, wow, California growing the fastest, but California also has the highest unemployment rate. Why does that make sense? How can you have the highest unemployment rate and have contracted the least of any state and growing faster than all of the other states? So these are the same states for 2021 and the unemployment rate at the end of December. And the reason is where the unemployment is. And that's something we're going to want to dig into more. So this is the job gain and loss from February 2020 to February 2022, before the pandemic recession, to the latest data that we have. It's for the US. And over on the left-hand side in the black is first logistics. And this is purchases of more goods, more online shopping, distribution of those goods. And then we've got technology, professional, scientific, and technical services, and software. And technology runs through many sectors, but these are the most intensive sectors. And these are all high value added sectors. One of the reasons why we saw California over on the left is California is disproportionate in those sectors. But where the pain is all the way over on the right in the red. And I've circled 4 sectors there. These 4 sectors make up 82% of all missing jobs. And those are hospitality, all the way over on the right. So we're going to look at that more closely. State and local government, and that's mostly in hiring back for service workers in the education part of local government. Healthcare and social services, and that's primarily in home healthcare and other services, which is personal care services. These are sectors, they're low income sectors. They don't generate a lot in terms of GDP, or at least GDP growth. And they require a high degree of human contact for the services being produced to get to the ultimate end user. And so this is what's holding back the economy. But this is the reason why we see growth in various states with higher unemployment, because the unemployment is in these low-income sectors. And that creates a social problem. But because the growth is in higher income sectors, including construction, it does provide opportunities for folks to move out of these lower income sectors with some job training. So let's turn to hospitality. That was the big one. And I want to show you something that relates mostly to California, but it generalizes to states across the US. And so hospitality depends on tourism in part. And tourism is foreign tourism. So that is, if you don't recognize that, that is Hollywood Boulevard. And then domestic tourism, and then work for home, the one person sitting there in the big office. And so let's take a look at some data. This is tourism expenditure and leisure and hospitality job recovery. So on the vertical axis is percentage change in leisure and hospitality jobs. On the horizontal axis is the tourism expenditure per capita. And the blue dots that you see represent states. Each one is an individual state, all 50 states plus the District of Columbia. The ones that you see at the top that have fully recovered, that are above zero, those are going to be Wyoming, Montana, Idaho, and Arkansas. So states that don't have a lot of tourism certainly don't have a lot of international tourism. The ones all the way over on the right, as you might expect, Hawaii, Nevada, Alaska, and District of Columbia. But if you take those outliers out and just kind of that cluster in the middle, you get an even sharper correlation. That dotted line that is the correlation line becomes steeper. And so tourism is really important for recovery. And what I wanted to do here, and what I wanted to show you, is how this impacts leisure and hospitality in California. And I think that generalizes across the country. But tourism is foreign tourism and domestic tourism. And on the left are international passenger arrivals at LAX on the top in red and SFO on the bottom. And it's relative to 2019. And that's still way down. It's 55 to 65% of capacity is not being used. Foreign tourists are not coming. And just as an example, a tourist that would come from Shanghai to Los Angeles goes back to Shanghai and at their own expense has to live in a hotel room in Shanghai for 2 to 3 weeks. That makes it prohibitive. But look on the right-hand side. This is Santa Rosa Charles M. Schulz Airport. This is the heart of California's wine country. And these are passenger arrivals. And the blue is 2018. And there's a seasonal there, of course. The dark orange or red is 2019. And then the gray is 2020. And you can see, not surprisingly, it just falls off a cliff. It drops down to zero and then kind of comes back a little bit. But what's interesting here is the orange line starts out in the tank and then starts building. And the last 3 months of 2021, it was above 2018 and 2019. So domestic tourism is recovering. Places that are catering to domestic tourists are recovering faster than places that are more dependent on foreign tourists. And to see that, oh, I had another slide here. Okay, so just a slight digression on work from home. Higher income counties in California, so now we move from the states to the counties. And higher income counties in California, they have a larger leisure and hospitality per capita employment. Makes sense, not that people who have more money eat out more. It's not clear that they do, but they do go out to restaurants that are fancier restaurants that require more staff and more services. And that generates more employment in leisure and hospitality. And they are also employment centers like New York and Boston and Seattle and San Francisco. And if people are working from home, then they're not coming into these high income employment centers. Then they're not going out to restaurants and taverns and the like after work or for lunch. So we built a spatial model, again, just for California, of the distance in each county from an international airport in California, where the foreign tourists would enter, but also those cities that have international airports are employment centers where work from home is much more likely because certainly in California, these employment centers are dominated by office work. And the graph you see here is the model prediction based on distance from the international airports of the recovery in leisure and hospitality jobs. And across the horizontal, the number of minutes from the international airport, the vertical is the percentage change in employment. And after about 2 hours away from an international airport in California, what you see is that most counties are only about 5% below their pre-pandemic level. So what this tells us is in the recovery of leisure and hospitality, certainly in my state, California, we're going to see that be a very slow process because it's going to be a slow process to get back these international tourists and for work from home to turn into work in the office. So I've been talking about California. Fran, do you see something similar in the localities that you follow across the country?
Yeah, yes, I do. Actually, we looked at places such as New York City, the Northeast, so the Boston area, Florida as well. And of course, Jerry talked about the West Coast. The correlations are the same. New York is very reliant on international travel, as an example, as is LA or San Francisco. Florida gets a lot of domestic travel, but it also has a lot of international travelers coming to the Orlando area, for example. So we're definitely seeing a lot of that. And, we look at a couple of airports. One, just as an example, California, it does correlate to the Midwest as well. In the Central Valley, Fresno is an area that only gets it has 11% of the population in the state, but only 0.8% of the airport traffic. Their revenues were up 11.6% compared to San Francisco and the Bay Area, which gets about 37% of the flights into California and has about 19% of the population. They're just back at 3%. So we're seeing that in California. We're seeing that in Texas on the East Coast, and it's really dramatic. Then the other wild card is with Asian travel being a very big part of our economies on the West Coast and other places. When will that come back? Those things are all correlating across the countries, to Jerry's point about distance, for sure.
Yeah, and for the East Coast airports, the interaction with Europe, for example, is very much dependent on the war in Ukraine, and now we're seeing an increase in infection rates in Europe from COVID. So there are a lot of wild cards here, but those are the places where there's leisure and hospitality. That's where we're missing the jobs, are going to find a long, slow slog back to pre-pandemic levels, much less growth from pre-pandemic levels. Okay, so we're getting a little short on time here. So I want to turn to housing, and I'll go through this a little fast, but we want to get to your questions as well. And this is from the New York Times Magazine. It says, will real estate ever be normal again? This is something we hear in California all the time, but this article is about Austin. And so we want to take a look at that. Home price appreciation, it really spiked in this last year, and we're expecting that home price appreciation to come down. That's on the left-hand side. That's the change in the FHFA home price index. But these higher prices that are being obtained for new homes is going to support continued construction at about 1.6 million per year, which is higher than the historical average. Of course, as you see in the right-hand side, for the last 10 years, we've been well below that. You see it tapers off a little bit, and that's just because of the higher interest rates, but it still stays at pretty high levels, and that creates a demand for construction workers. And then is that going to stick around? Well, the answer is yes, and it's because of demographics. So people have money, they have good jobs, it's a good labor market, and this is the demographics is population by age, boomers in red, Gen X in green, and the millennials in blue. And what you see is we have yet to see the peak of millennials get to the age where they're going to make a decision about having children, starting a family. And there was this narrative for a while, millennials are going to want to live in the city, never live in the suburbs, even if they have children, but they might not. And that turns out to be false. They're moving in droves out to the suburbs and starting families. Fertility rates are lower, but this is a huge cohort, and that is going to support continued demand for housing, particularly since we've had this underbuilding. So we'll take a kind of a quick look at this migration. Again, the migration has been pushing up housing, and I want to look at migration from the Bay Area to 4 cities. So that's going to be Nashville, Austin, Boise, and Seattle. And just jumping into that, this is the relative price of Bay Area homes. Left is San Francisco and the right is Silicon Valley, as compared to 1990. And in both cases, we find that for Austin, Seattle, Boise, and Nashville, that the relative price of homes, that is the price of homes in the Bay Area relative to the price of homes in these 4 cities, has gone down. So San Francisco is getting more expensive, less affordable, but relatively more affordable. And you can see that in these headlines from various cities. Boise home values go from affordable to unattainable, 300% increase in home prices in Boise. Valley families are feeling the pressure of affordable housing in Phoenix, 200%, Austin 169, and in Seattle 166, whereas these expensive California cities, and you see this in the East Coast as well, Los Angeles 138 and San Francisco 148. So you can still sell a house in San Francisco and get more house in Austin, but you're going to get about 70% of the house that you would have been able to purchase in that transaction just 5 years ago. And that makes Austin a little less attractive and eases the pressure, the migration pressure, and those home prices. And we can see that between Los Angeles and Dallas. And I just want to focus your attention on the right-hand side, that the relative price in Dallas compared to Los Angeles has been kind of constant, meaning home prices in the 2 cities have been rising at about the same rate. And it's sort of settled in at about 6% above what it was in 1990. And there's basically been no migration, in spite of the narrative to the contrary, between Los Angeles and Dallas. Lots of Angelenos have moved to Dallas, but lots of Texans have moved from Dallas to Los Angeles. And the migration over the last 5 years has been only 6,000 people. So that's basically zero. And so in these cities like Phoenix and Boise and so on, you're going to see the migration slow down. In fact, today, the median home price in Sacramento is the same as in Austin and in Boise. And so that leads us to the summary so we can get to your questions. Fundamentals indicate continued solid growth led by technology, construction, and logistics. Defense durable goods demand from the US and Europe is going to support growth in the out years. Inflation is going to remain high for the next 12 months and then subside, but watch for the potential of a wage price spiral. And geographical and sectoral inequality is going to increase. And we have geopolitical and pandemic risks abound, which is why the crystal ball here is cracked and has a Band-Aid on it. Lots to think about. So let me finish here with a picture of the Santa Monica Pier in January. Okay, and
Well, Fran, Dr. Nichols, clearly some incredible insight, and thank you so much for being so detailed, Dr. Nicholsberg. And Fran, thank you again for your insight and additional clarity on some of those points. So it does look like we have some questions coming through the chat feature there in your YouTube link. Like I mentioned early on in the presentation, that we did have several questions in our content and our distribution emails that we'd sent out prior to this event. There was a form in there, and we did gather some questions prior to the event. So I'm going to start with those. And as you guys start to hear the interaction, please, if you do have any thoughts, not necessarily a question or comments, and if we don't get to those questions today for time's sake, we will follow up individually with those after the presentation today, in addition to the recording and the special offer at the end. So first question that we received about a week ago was regarding the forecast average annual consumption. 2024 shows a decline to a level lower than 9 of the last 10 years. In your opinion, Dr. Nicholsberg, what is the cause of this big drop?
so it's twofold. One is that big surge in consumption that I showed means that you're at a much higher base.
Right.
And the second is that the growth in the economy, while still positive, is going to be 2 to 2.5%. And so you're not getting the same kinds of increases that you got the previous 2 years. Yeah, so that's what's giving us a 2% increase in consumption. But that's out in 2024. So, of course, there's much more uncertainty about that number than the ones that are closer in.
Understood. And we talked a lot about oil prices throughout the middle part of your presentation. One of the questions we got was, how long does it take for declining oil prices to actually reach consumers at the gas pump? And I know that's a relevant topic for all of us right now. What is your opinion on how long it takes for those declining oil prices that you mentioned to reach actual consumers at the gas pump?
Historically, it's been quite a long time.
Mm-hmm.
And, we think of the gasoline retailers as being in these competitive markets because there's so many gasoline stations. But in fact, they only compete directly with the ones that are closest to them. And so we've seen historically that even though petroleum prices come down, it takes months, if not maybe closer to 3 quarters, before we start seeing the impact at the pump, because the markets are not kind of a unified market.
And just now, question came through in connection with the gas prices. Fran, this one might be for you. Is you mentioned in some of your remarks the connection between gas prices and sales tax revenue. How well do those changes in gas prices correlate with changes in sales tax revenue?
I think it's an important and good question. I think they really go hand in hand. We're seeing during the pandemic, we were watching and tracking sales tax revenues for numerous clients, and you would just see the major dips in consumption of fuel. Now it's starting to go up. The demand is up, and we're just seeing it increasing dramatically. They go hand in hand, literally falling up together. As gas prices go up, it's also a major component of the sales tax revenue. So it's going up dramatically. And then, of course, it will correct. As Jerry talked about later, we'll start to see the price of oil coming down. It'll be gradually slowing down. But oil prices and sales tax have an immediate impact on revenue. It's a little different than ramping up to produce increased production. It's once you go to the pump, you're paying a percentage on whatever that gallon price is. And what's interesting, in most states, you're paying a percentage of all the taxes that are added into that gallon of fuel at the local level. So it's compounded, but they go hand in hand for sure.
Excellent. And Jerry, you mentioned the shift to electric vehicles. One of the questions that came through just a moment ago was Tesla's huge factory in China was shut down recently for COVID. How do you think that will affect and impact us in the U.S.?
Tesla's factory in China is to produce for the Chinese market. So Tesla's not producing in China and exporting to the U.S. Rather, the Teslas that are being sold in the U.S. are being manufactured in Fremont in their one factory, and they're working on opening a factory in Texas, which will increase that supply. But the shutdown of the Tesla factory in China is not going to affect the U.S. market.
Excellent. And next one is around shelter and new and used cars. It says, you mentioned in the cumulative contribution to core CPI slide that key components of inflation are shelter and new and used cars. In your opinion, why will inflation drop so quickly this year?
So a couple of reasons. One is that oil prices, which feed into production of all kinds of goods and services, are not continuing to go up. In fact, they're starting to go down. So that's going to be a slower increase in energy prices. Second, as we kind of went through, there was a lot of migration pushing up rental costs. That's going to slow down. And then the third is we have built in an assumption, and it's just an assumption, that supply chain issues are going to be increasingly resolved, which means more product to market, and that means lower prices. And the reason why that's an assumption is there's a lot of risk to that. And just as you mentioned, the shutdown of the Tesla plant. Well, there's also been a shutdown of Foxconn plants that support Apple phones. Sure. And the list kind of goes on and on. So those are the reasons why we see inflation coming down, still being high this year, but coming down as we move through the year.
Excellent. And this next one is an interest rate affecting stock market question. So it basically says, how do you think rising interest rates affect the stock market?
So that's one I'm going to punt on because forecasting stock market prices in the near term, whether it's with interest rates or kind of in whatever way you want to do it, tends to be fraught with all kinds of problems. But in the long run, equities are a reflection of the earning power of the companies that they represent. And with the strong economy, we're expecting profits to stay up and indeed increase, particularly in defense industries. And that should increase their equity values. Obviously, it differs from company to company.
And this next one, Jerry, is about the conflict in Europe right now. You clearly touched on that a few moments ago in your presentation, but it says, what does your forecast anticipate in terms of conflict in Europe? Is there an impact other than increase in defense spending?
Yes. Russia and Ukraine are both major producers of grain. And so, and the price of grains is set in world markets. With those two countries' production of grain either diminishing dramatically or the export from those countries being blocked because of the conflict, that means that food prices are going to go up because we're going to have much less grain in the market. So that's one of the implications of it. We have not built into our forecast any significant expansion of the war in Ukraine to economic disruption in Europe. But one of the risks is if, for example, Germany were to cut completely its dependence on its importation of Russian gas and oil, the German economy would go through a recession because not all of that can be made up by imports from elsewhere. And German purchases of U.S. goods would go down. So that would have a negative impact on the U.S. economy as well.
Got it. And one last one, at least so far, is around tourism, and this can be for you, Fran, or Jerry. It says tourism in proximity to airports. When will international tourism come back, and how do you believe it will affect different regions?
Yeah, maybe
please go ahead. I'll start and then turn it over to Fran
for
better detail. We're not seeing it happening in the next 12 months. So that means that 2023 at the earliest, we were expecting Europe to come back sooner than Asia, but now I'm not so sure. So my thinking today is 2023 at the earliest, we start seeing it come back, but it's not going to come back all at once. Fran, what do you think?
No, I would agree with Jerry, and I think we're seeing that in places like San Francisco, New York, places we talked about earlier. So that means the recovery will take a little longer for some of those cities, especially in hospitality, leisure, and things like that. I mentioned my sister traveling from New Zealand earlier. They literally this week are starting to schedule flights back into San Francisco, but it's very restricted. There's procedures around protocol about making sure you're COVID negative and things. So it's coming back very slowly. I also think the world events right now are causing a little more uncertainty about international travel for many folks. So I think Jerry's absolutely right. And we're factoring in longer term recoveries for jurisdictions that have international tourism as a driver and international travel. I think that's the one part of the post-pandemic that we definitely have a long ways to go in terms of recovery.
Yeah, one thing that's interesting in this regard is, if you think about Florida, so Orlando and Miami are huge destinations for international tourists. In fact, Florida, along with New York and California, host 3/4 of all international tourists that come to the U.S. But because international tourists are not coming to the U.S., for the same reason, U.S. tourists are not going abroad. And they're going to Disney World, and they're going to Miami Beach and Panama City. So Florida is less impacted, as is Anaheim in California, because of the substitution of domestic tourists. Now, international tourism, when it comes to Canadian tourism, so this affects certainly Texas and the California desert communities around Palm Springs, that started to pick up because the border is now open again, finally.
And in those jurisdictions, we're seeing their revenues coming back very rapidly in hotel travel. Their hotel taxes, their sales taxes have come back very quickly, being stopgap with the domestic travel. And then, as Jerry mentioned.
Yeah, so Fran, that would be San Antonio, South Padre Island area, yes, Miami
absolutely.
Beach.
Yeah, all of those places, especially their hotel taxes are strong. And then the sales tax correlates very closely to that because people are staying and obviously going out and eating and going to venues and things of that type. So absolutely.
Fran, Dr. Nicholsberg, thanks so much for doing this. On behalf of our entire client base, ones that were in attendance and ones that will see this recording that couldn't make it today, I personally, and on behalf of them, appreciate your time and commitment to answering many of the questions that came through today. For those on the phone, for those that are watching live, if we were unable to get to any of those questions, we will follow up with you each individually with direct feedback shortly after our discussion. As I mentioned earlier, before we end today's presentation, in partnership with UCLA Anderson Forecast and other industry economists, we have launched a new program called Economic Insights, exclusively for you, the Avenue client. Today's presentation certainly gave us all a glimpse into the future economic impacts of today's market. We've taken this one step further to bring you an opportunity to gain direct access and deeper insight through our Economic Insights package. This package will include national and regional specific economic forecast presentations, much like the ones you saw today. Also, direct access to other exclusive economist speakers. In addition, a quarterly distribution of a comprehensive economic forecast report packed with over 70 pages of national and regional data This report includes summary analysis of each of the industries that you saw today, along with specific forecast summary tables that provide data behind a lot of the visuals and graphs that were in Dr. Nicholsberg's presentation. In addition, an invite-only social forum where clients can regularly interact with Avenue's local government experts and industry leaders. And lastly, regularly hosted on-demand Q&A roundtable sessions with UCLA's world-renowned economists. All of this information and further summary will be in your inbox shortly. We're going to send that out to you in an email shortly after today's webinar, so please look out for that. Please feel free to forward that to any of your colleagues. We'd be happy to answer any questions you have regarding that package or that economic insights package that we just talked about. We really appreciate you guys for being here. Thank you so much. We deeply appreciate, most importantly, our partnership together, and we really look forward to continued success. Thanks so much, and see you all soon.